Welcome to watercolor lesson number 1. By the end of this lesson and practice session, you will know the big ideas relating to the technique of watercolor. In order to master the skills and techniques of this medium, you have to first learn the characteristics involved in watercolor painting. In this lesson, you will learn essential watercolor vocabulary, how to set up a watercolor station, the supplies needed, the basics of watercolor painting, and a quick review of the color theory. The first thing you're going to do to set up your watercolor station is to put down some newspaper to protect your work area and make cleanup much easier. Next, you'll take your watercolor paper and tape it down onto a board of some sort. This will help you to move the watercolor paper, and also if you need to lift it up and move it in any way to help with the drips and the flow. You'll then take your paints, paintbrushes, and water and set it up to the side of your dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, I put my paints and supplies to my right. This will prevent any drips of water from getting on your page if you're going over a smaller portion of it. And finally, you're going to want some paper towel nearby to dab off your brush and in case of any spills. You may also want to use an apron. Although watercolor is very forgiving and comes out of most clothing, it's still a good idea to always wear an apron. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing you need to know about watercolor are two terms: dry paint versus wet paint. Dry paint simply means there's more color on the brush than water. Wet paint means there's more water on the brush than color. These first lines I'm painting are an example of very dry paint. There's just a little bit of water mixed in with the color. This gives me paint that is very easily controlled. With dry paint, you get a much more saturated version of the color, which means the colors are going to be brighter and more intense once they are dry. Now, below this line, I'm going to start using watercolor that is wetter. That means there's a lot more water than paint on the brush. I actually mix the paint on a separate spot to really dilute the color down. One quality of watercolor paintings is that they look very different when they are wet versus when they are dry. So you never really know what your painting will look like until it's thoroughly dried. So let's start off with very dry paint on dry paper. I've added a little bit of water to the paint pigment and I'm mixing it around to get a nice thick paint. And then I'm just going to draw on the dry paper in any way that I'd like. I'll also add in some other colors to show you how the dry paint mixes together. Keep in mind, this will look different once it's dry. I'm going to speed things up a little bit and I'll stop as I get to the next technique. So there's our first technique, dry paint on dry paper. We'll now move on and continue to use dry paper, but this time we're going to dilute the paint down a lot more and use wet paint on dry paper. You can already see with this wet paint, the color is not as vibrant or intense. However, watch closely as I add different colors of paint. You'll find with wet paint, the colors blend in a really cool way. Wet paint is a bit more difficult to control, but you end up with some cool, unpredictable patterns. Here's a quick look at our dry versus wet paint side by side. Our next watercolor technique is to take dry paper and change its consistency by adding a thin layer of water. I'm then going to take some wet paint and paint it into that water. On the bottom half, I'm going to do the same thing, but with some dry paint. As you can see, painting on wet paper means you have almost no control of where the paint goes, but it does end up making really cool designs. The final watercolor technique that we're going to look at today is called a wash. A wash can be used to create interesting backgrounds for any watercolor design. A wash is simply covering the paper with a semi-transparent layer of color. It's easiest to achieve this look with a thicker brush. You'll want the paint to be quite diluted, but feel free to play around with color. It does not need to be one solid color. So to end lesson part 1, I'll show the dry versions of these techniques side by side. First, we have dry paint on dry paper, very controlled and saturated with color. Next, we have wet paint on dry paper. The colors are not quite as vibrant, but they blend together much nicer. Now we have wet and dry paint on wet paper. It creates a cool marbled look, but you have almost no control over where the paint goes. And finally, a simple yet beautifully effective wash, which colors your paper with a thin layer of paint.